Good evening. Thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Stephen Schmidt from the Greenwich Library, and I'm delighted to welcome you to Authors Live at Greenwich Library. This series is made possible through the support of the Greenwich Library Board of Trustees and contributions by generous donors. Thanks also to the Greenwich Economic Forum for co-sponsoring this program. We're also delighted to have C-SPAN's Book TV here as well. A few reminders. Please keep your mask on at all times. Please silence your cell phone and refrain from using it and taking any photos during the event. Books will be available for signing after the event outside the theater. And if you have any questions for Gregory, we will take them after his talk. Greg Zuckerman is the author of The Greatest Trade Ever and The Frackers, and is the special writer at the Wall Street Journal. He is a three-time winner of the Gerald Loeb Award, the highest honor in business journalism. At the Journal, Zuckerman writes about financial firms, personalities and trades, as well as hedge funds and other investing and business topics. He also appears regularly on CNBC, Fox Business, and other networks and radio stations around the globe. This evening, he'll be talking about his latest book, A Shot to Save the World, which tells the story of a small group of unlikely and untested scientists and executives who raced to come up with the COVID-19 vaccine. They scrambled to turn their life's work into life-saving vaccines in a matter of months, each gunning to make a big breakthrough and beat each other for the glory that a vaccine guaranteed. And it could be said that thanks to them, we are together in this room tonight. This event has been several years in the making. Greg was originally scheduled to speak here in April 2020 on his book, The Man Who Solved the Market. But please join me in finally welcoming Greg Zuckerman to Greenwich Library.
Good evening, everybody. Hope everybody is doing well and healthy, and it's nice to see people in person. I apologize. I'm the only one who gets to not wear a mask this evening as the speaker, so I apologize for that. But hopefully we're entering a world where things are improving a little bit, and maybe down the road we can all enjoy a mask-free existence. So this evening is a long time in making. I do want to thank my hosts, Stephen, and others who worked hard to make this event possible. I wrote a book in 2019 called The Man Who Solved the Market. So we were going to plan an event then. It didn't work out. Events changed in early and later in 2020, but I'm so thrilled to be able to do it tonight. I am going to talk about my new book, A Shot to Save the World. I'm going to talk about why I wrote it. I'm going to talk a little bit about why these vaccines are underappreciated, why they're unlikely as well in so many different ways. And the people behind them are even more, and the methods are even more unlikely. And I'm going to make some observations about this era and maybe draw some lessons from the endeavor, the successful efforts to deliver these vaccines. So first, I'll explain why I wrote this book and why a guy like me, a financial reporter, I've been at the Journal since 1996, a long time, would write about this topic, which is a book about science in many ways. So here I was in my basement in suburban New Jersey in the spring and early summer of 2020, and it was a very discouraging time. It was a difficult time. We all remember that period. It's going to be one that we will never forget. We'll tell our grandchildren and children and others about it, I think, in years to come. And I was looking for a reason for optimism, for hope. It was a time when there's a lot of pessimism out there. And I started doing some work. I'm a reporter at the Wall Street Journal, and I started hearing about those who were chasing a vaccine, trying to develop shots to protect us all. And it gave me some hope. There was a weird, interesting contrast between those in my life and in all of our lives. It was a time when people were down and worried and concerned. And there was a contrast between the researchers that I started speaking with who were upbeat and optimistic. And what's really fascinating is that just a few months earlier, it was all changed. There was a different dichotomy. In January of 2020, late January, I was traveling in the Middle East. I was in Israel. I was in London. I was walking through Heathrow Airport, and I wasn't wearing a mask. I was with my two sons, and they'd heard about this. We all had heard about this virus, and they were a little more concerned than I was. They were wearing a mask, but I'd read, what we all had read, that you're not really supposed to be wearing a mask. Maybe it was detrimental. And also, frankly, people were giving me looks, and they were looking at me odd as I walked through Heathrow with my makeshift mask, and I ended up just taking it off. And frankly, many of us, if not most of us, in February of 2020, we're not that concerned. Yeah, there was a virus in China, but didn't we also go through earlier coronaviruses, MERS, SARS? These things kind of go away, Zika, et cetera. People get all nervous and scared, and then in the end, it's not that big a concern. So many of us were relatively unconcerned about this virus. But at that moment, the people who I write about in my book were scared and fearful and worried. And many of them decided to try to do something. So back then in early 2020, they were really worried, and many of us were not. But a few months later, it flipped. And I was worried and concerned for my family, and many of us in my family did get sick. I have an uncle who died with COVID. It wasn't clear if it was because of COVID or how it contributed. I had a neighbor who passed away. It was a difficult period. And yet I drew a lot of hope and optimism from those I started writing about. So that's one reason I wrote the book. The other is that I don't think we fully appreciate the enormity of this accomplishment, this achievement. It is the greatest achievement of modern science to develop these vaccines that are so effective and so safe, and to do so quickly. I think we're a little too close to the achievement to appreciate it, to fully appreciate it. Even those of us who are pro-vaccine, who are comfortable taking these vaccines, comfortable with the relative risks, the limited risks, are still, I don't think, appreciated enough. We go in there and we roll up the sleeves and we maybe complain a little bit about maybe a side effect or two for a day or two. But as I'll demonstrate, I think shortly, it is very conceivable that these vaccines would not have been ready even for several years. And we have to be appreciative of how fast they were developed and how effective they are. And again, they are modern science's greatest achievement. And they're also modern finance's greatest achievement, as I'll demonstrate, I think, in a few minutes, the role that science played. And these vaccines could not have been developed were it not for finance. So that's another reason why I set out to write the book, to explain how these vaccines evolved and how they were developed. But often, at least in my case, when I write a book, it kind of takes a little while till I realize the real reason I'm writing it. In other words, the theme that has captured me and that excites me. And frankly, there's a common theme in all my work, in all my books. And it only kind of hits me as I've thrown myself into it. And as after I've agreed to write the book, and I'm up, till 3 a.m. most nights trying to understand and talk to people and dig and get behind the scenes. And the theme is the unexpected hero and the unexpected achievement. My first book is called The Greatest Trade Ever, and it's about those who anticipated the financial meltdown of 2008. And if you think about it, who should have been prepared and made money from it and did the best during that period? It should have been the banks, right? The banks are the ones who created the toxic mortgage product that made everyone kind of sick and brought down the financial system. And they were the ones hurt, among the most hurt by that era. Short sellers didn't do well. Mortgage experts, housing experts, they were caught flat-footed. And who did anticipate the financial crisis of 2008? It's a bunch of odd characters I write about in that book. A few years after that, I wrote a book called the frackers about this energy revolution. All of a sudden, we're producing so much oil and gas that we're actually exporting it. And it wasn't Chevron and BP and Exxon. It was a bunch of odd, interesting, quirky individuals, North Dakota and Oklahoma and Texas, people you would not have expected. And then I did in 2019, it's called a book called The Man Who Solved the Market. It's about the greatest investment firm, hedge funds, ever. And it's not individuals who even care about trading. When they grew up, they didn't go to business school. They didn't read about Buffett and Peter Lynch. Some of them aren't even capitalists. They're socialists. They're not even sure what they are. And they're scientists. They're mathematicians. And yet they developed the greatest trading firm in history. So that same theme, unlikely heroes, it struck me. I'm in my basement in New Jersey writing about the chase for these vaccines. And the first company that struck me, that captured me, that really intrigued me was Moderna. And Moderna is among the most unlikely heroes out there. And I'll explain why. So Moderna was started around 2010. The CEO's name is Stéphane Bancel. Stéphane Bancel, an immigrant from France, he is among the most difficult bosses you can find. He is a hard-driving individual. Early on at Moderna, they're in Cambridge, Massachusetts, a biotech. He pushed his people so hard that they were collapsing in the office, in the parking lot of Moderna in Cambridge, at home, hitting their heads, being rushed to the hospital, bleeding. He fired people very quickly and easily. He could be really difficult. And yet he was also inspirational. He had this ability to inspire people that we're going to be the ones. He literally said to his people, there's going to be a crisis someday. We are going to be the company that steps up and saves lives. And half the people working there were miserable and didn't like the fact that he didn't appreciate their work and could be a really difficult boss. But other people said, no, we appreciate the fact that he believes in what we're trying to do and in saving lives and changing history. And there was this real contrast within the company. And eventually those that couldn't really handle his difficult personality exited, and he brought in people that could. But that took a few years. And frankly, by the beginning of this pandemic, on eve of the pandemic, we're talking January 2020, there really was no other company of size, they weren't big, but they weren't small, that was filled and dealt with so much suspicion as Moderna and Stéphane Bancel. They had never produced a drug. They never produced a vaccine. They had shifted. They originally were called Moderna Therapeutics, which is drugs. And they had shifted from drugs to vaccines because they could not make they could not make drugs work. They couldn't develop effective and safe and approved drugs. So they had to shift to vaccines. And vaccines have never been a popular business for companies in the world of pharmaceuticals, for a number of reasons. Partly it's because vaccines take a long time. Sometimes you develop a vaccine, it's very expensive, and you don't need it by the time you develop it, the pathogen dissipates. And if you remember the earlier MERS and SARS and Zika, et cetera, that happens often. And if you think about it, a vaccine you give to someone once in a lifetime, maybe even a little bit more frequently, once every few years, whereas a drug, I take a statin every night. So in the world of pharmaceuticals, in the world of biotech, no one really wants to be a vaccine company. So the fact that Moderna had to shift to vaccines from drugs caught a lot of people's attention. And they said, these guys do not have any really approach that's going to work. And Stéphane Bancel himself was someone that people had a lot of suspicions about. He wasn't a scientist. He's a Harvard Business School graduate. He is a very persuasive person. He's a great salesman. He was able to raise a lot of money, but a lot of the people that he raised money from weren't sort of biotech experts. They were sort of sovereign wealth funds from the Gulf, that kind of thing. And here he was raising billions of dollars for the dream of using mRNA. And we're going to get to it in a second, what mRNA is, the dream of using mRNA to develop vaccines. And a lot of people by 2020 had enough of Stéphane Bancel and had enough of Moderna. The stock was down 50% from its IPO price. People were rolling their eyes. He kept shifting their goal. And one other weird, odd thing, people started comparing him, and I think it's really unfair, but people were really starting to compare Stéphane Bancel to Elizabeth Holmes, the former founder, CEO of Theranos. And again, I don't think it was fair, but there were a lot of commonalities. Neither of them had ever really were very open about their science. At least for a number of years, Moderna wasn't. They weren't very transparent. They didn't appear at industry conferences and such, seminars. They didn't publish for a number of years. Later they did, but for a number of years they didn't. And there were other weird similarities. Stéphane Bancel and Elizabeth Holmes, both, they're outgoing, they're persuasive, they're good fundraisers, and they both love black turtlenecks. It's a weird commonality. So they had that in common. And again, by 2020, early 2020, they were a company that many people suspected might be, fraud is a strong word, but maybe exaggerating their abilities. And the people within Moderna were very frustrated by that. They were aware of all the suspicions out there, and they knew that they were making progress on their approach. Yeah, they didn't have a vaccine. Yeah, they didn't have a drug, but they thought they were making progress. They were making headway. And they were like, why does everyone point fingers at us? Why does everybody suspect us? And then this virus emerges. And Stéphane Bancel, we're talking January 2020, says, you know what? Yeah, we don't have anything that to speak of in terms of a vaccine or a drug, but we do have this approach using mRNA. And I think we can use it to develop a vaccine pretty quickly. And if you think about it, it was the ultimate risk, because he said, guys, we have to shift to try to develop a vaccine. And had it failed, people would have gone from rolling their eyes around Moderna to have given up. They would just kind of say, okay, enough of this company. We've given them the benefit of the doubt way too long. Look, they failed on this new endeavor. It's not going to work. So they had a lot of risk. They gambled when they said, we're going to set aside our existing work and we're going to focus on a COVID-19 vaccine. And yet they were able to pull it off. And it's a remarkable, surprising achievement on their part. So Moderna is a very unlikely hero. I'll talk about another unlikely hero. That's Ugur Sahin. Ugur Sahin is the CEO of a company called BioNTech. He and his wife, Aslam Turki, they're both scientists, both very serious. They're both quirky and unusual. They live in an apartment in Mainz, Germany. They originally were both Turkish, immigrants from Turkey, but they live in Mainz now. They live in an apartment. Ugur takes his bike to work every day, doesn't own a car. When they go on vacation, Ugur brings these hulking big computers with him to these resorts. And he literally, so he can continue doing his work. He literally brings stacks of papers to the pool where his daughter swims. And he's a bit of an obsessive and serious researcher. And what's interesting is that he's not somebody who's an infectious disease expert whatsoever. What he and his wife have always been passionate about is developing a vaccine to protect against cancer. They've always been very, very focused on cancer and helping people with cancer and finding the solution for cancer. And they spent years on it. And once again, just like Moderna, they didn't have that much to show for it by early 2020. By January 2020, no vaccine, no drug, nothing like that. They were a mid-sized company, a smallish company in Mainz, Germany. And yet he said he's having breakfast with his wife, Aslam Turki, in January 2020 in an outdoor cafe in Mainz. And he said to his wife, I just read about this new virus in Wuhan, China, and I'm really worried. And Aslam's like, oh, don't you remember that last coronavirus a few years ago? Nothing ever emerged from that. Nothing didn't last that long. And Ugur says, no, this is different. And why was he so sure? Why was he so certain something bad was coming? Is because what he read, and he was smart to pick up on that, is that there was asymptomatic spread of this virus, as opposed to the earlier coronaviruses. Those were lethal too, but those didn't spread the world because we could isolate those who had the disease. Whereas with this new virus, it was asymptomatic spread. And at that point, we don't know who has it. We don't know who's going to get it. And he knew by then it was probably spreading. And he realized that Wuhan is an enormous city. It's bigger than New York and Chicago combined. So he put two and two together. He also saw the flights coming out of Wuhan. He realized it was probably spreading all over the world. And he said, yeah, we haven't developed anything. And we're not even infectious disease experts. We're cancer people. But one of our approaches, it's not even our main one of our approaches that we've been developing is using mRNA. And I'm going to get to mRNA in a few minutes and explain it. But it was one of their approaches. They used immunotherapy, they used others, but one of their approaches is mRNA. And Ugur said, you know what, maybe we can use mRNA to develop a vaccine for this new virus. And they threw themselves into it. And it's to their credit that they picked up on the virus early and that they threw themselves into it when others didn't. And I really want to emphasize that theme of unlikely heroes, because take a step back for a second. Who should have been expected to step up and save the day and develop a vaccine, an effective vaccine to save lives? It should have been the vaccine experts, companies that produce vaccines, right? Merck is considered the preeminent vaccine company. Measles, mumps, rubella, that's all Merck. They've got a history of it, and I write about it in my book. It's a fascinating history about their company and the evolution and their efforts in terms of vaccines. And I write in my book about how in early 2020, when Ugur Sahin and Stefan Bancel were getting scared about this new virus, some scientists within Merck also got nervous and concerned, and they said, hey, we're Merck. We should be the ones stepping up here and creating a vaccine. But others said, well, I don't know. What about the fact that those earlier coronaviruses died out? We're making a lot of progress in other really important areas like cancer research. We don't want to take our eye off the ball there. It's really expensive to develop a new vaccine. And there was a rift within Merck I write about in the book. And as a result, they didn't go 100% chasing this new vaccine for the new virus. They put a little effort into it, and they eventually developed a drug that's somewhat helpful. But they're not the ones who stepped up to help us. So again, they're the more, I talk about unlikely heroes. They're the people that really should have stepped up. But it's not just Merck, Sanofi, GSK. Those are the vaccine giants. And instead, again, Moderna, BioNTech, and some others I write about in my book. There's a individual named Adrian Hill. Adrian is probably the most, how should I put this, disliked scientist that I can identify in that world. He is notorious for standing up at industry events, seminars, conferences, and just ripping into his colleagues, their approaches. You don't know what you're doing. This isn't going to work. That's a foolish approach. He does not mince words. He is very brutally honest with his colleagues. And yet he himself had really nothing to show for his years and years of work. He's at University of Oxford. He runs a senior group there. And by early 2020, he too had made some progress. He's got a different approach. It's not mRNA. I'll talk about it in a second, his approach. But he didn't really have that much to show for his years of work, despite his comfort in critiquing others in his field. And frankly, some people who were subjected to his critiques, they didn't mind them so much. They said, hey, he's helping me improve my approach, and I can handle the criticism. And that's the scientific method. And people sometimes can be critical of each other, and there's some value in that. And other people, Joe, just had real difficulty with the insults and the invective. You know, he does get credit. They eventually did develop a vaccine that is very helpful and is and not so much, we don't need it in the United States. It was never approved and never tried to be approved in the United States, but it's the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, and it's available in the UK. It was very popular, and it's in other countries, and it's been effective. Not quite as effective as the mRNA ones, but it's effective. And again, unlikely characters. One last company I'll talk about is Novovax. Novovax is a company outside of Washington, D.C., and they spent years developing different vaccines. And by early in January 2020, again, on the eve of this pandemic, their stock was about $3 a share. They only had money to last for a few months, and they were going to go bankrupt. Employees were sending resumes out, and yet they risked it all and said, hey, we're going to try to develop a vaccine for COVID. And they developed a really effective one. We don't need it right now. We have so many good ones in the United States, but elsewhere it's going to prove really helpful. And already it's in some countries in Asia, and it's going to be in Africa too. So very, very much unexpected hero and an unexpected achievement. So I'm going to talk briefly about it. So I talked already about unexpected heroes. Now I'm going to talk about an unexpected approach, and that is mRNA. And I assume we're all familiar with the term. We know mRNA stands for messenger RNA, which I'm sure some people are experts in or familiar with, and other people maybe could use a little refresher or education. I'll do it briefly. Messenger RNA is a molecule. We all have it inside of us. It transports the genetic message from the DNA in the cell to the part of the cell where proteins are created that keep us alive. So in other words, messenger RNA is we're born with it, and we rely on it. And it's crucial that we would create. It helps us deliver those messages so we can create proteins. So scientists said, well, hold on a second. This messenger RNA in our body, we rely on it. It helps develop you can create any kind of protein. What if we created it, developed it synthetically in the laboratory? So in other words, just like sugar is natural and you find sugar in nature, you can also create it in the lab, and it's pretty similar. Same kind of thing. Researchers said, well, what if we could develop messenger RNA in the laboratory? And then you say to yourself, well, why would they want to do that? Well, then you can send a message to the body to create any kind of protein. And as a result, you can create any kind of drug or vaccine in the body, right? It sounds like a brilliant idea and an obvious one. But just as quickly as people got excited about the idea of creating, developing synthetic version of mRNA molecule in the laboratory to inject it in the body and to create any kind of protein, just as quickly as people got excited, they said, yeah, maybe not. Let's not waste our time. And that's because mRNA gets chopped up by the body, momentarily, and it gets eliminated. And I'm simplifying it, but the point being that mRNA is a short-lived molecule, and it's not one you can really depend on. How are you going to actually build a vaccine or a drug that depends on this mRNA? This molecule gets chopped up and eliminated quickly. So, and there are other reasons too. You can inject it in the body, and the immune system fights it off. There are all kinds of mechanisms there to recognize a foreign body like mRNA, such that it's risky to base any kind of therapeutic, any kind of vaccine on mRNA. So the conventional wisdom for years in the world of science was, don't waste your time studying, working with, basing any drug or vaccine on mRNA. That was the conventional wisdom. That was what the experts all said. And it's funny, I talk to audiences often about my book, and there are always some vaccine hesitant kind of people in the audience, and I love discussing it. I hope there's some people here potentially who are a little bit vaccine hesitant. But one of the concerns you always hear about mRNA as well, it's going to change my DNA. It's going to stay in my body. No, that's the fascinating thing. Nobody ever wanted to work with mRNA in the world of science because it gets chopped up and eliminated so quickly. They were like rolling their eyes. Don't waste your time if you're in the world of science. You're gonna base your career on this molecule that gets eliminated? No. And yet the people I write about in my book ignore the conventional wisdom. They said, yeah, we know all the challenges of mRNA. We're going to try to overcome them. And it started with an individual, a doctor named John Wolfe, I write about, who in the late 1980s, first in San Diego and then in Wisconsin, University of Wisconsin, he treated children with genetic abnormalities. And it was heartbreaking stuff. Families would bring children to him from all over the world. And he was really good at diagnosing what the issue was. And the parents were very appreciative. Sometimes they develop new diets for the children that would help them live a better life. But John Wolfe was frustrated because he wanted to cure these children, not just give them a new diet. So at night, he'd go into the laboratory and try to figure out some approach that might work. And he was the first one to show that despite the skepticism, there's potential for using mRNA as part of maybe a vaccine, maybe a drug, to create a protein in the body. That's all he kind of showed, the possibilities. And my book in some ways is about, you can picture it as a relay race almost, where you have a group of scientists that are running and making progress, and it looks like they're going to win the race, and then they stumble and fall, and they kind of pass the baton, as it were, to the next group. So there was a group at Duke I write about. Eli Gilboa was the leader of that endeavor, and he picked up that baton, and he made more progress on using mRNA to produce a protein in the body. He actually didn't even work in the body. He was just working in the laboratory. It took a while before they were actually finding some evidence in the body itself. But that's what the scientific process is. And in some ways, my book is just as much about the process and innovation and creativity and how to keep researchers going for so many years. I mean, frankly, I learned to appreciate so much those behind the researchers, the scientists behind these efforts, because so I'm a journalist, I'm a writer. I like to produce work and share it with the world. At the Wall Street Journal, it takes me a few days sometimes for an article, maybe a few weeks, a month or so at most. My books, I try to, they're always kind of timely. I put them out. I like to share them with the world. At most, I'll spend a year and a half, 2 years on my books. These researchers, they will go into in the bowels of these laboratories all over the country, all over the world, and hope to make some incremental progress. And half the time, or more than half the time, they run into some roadblock and they have to give up the effort. And that persistence, that creativity, resilience, stubbornness, I came to really appreciate and admire. And I wish I kind of shared some of those traits, but that's what it took to get mRNA to work. So eventually there were two scientists that maybe some people have read about, Carrico and Weissman at University of Pennsylvania. They wrote a groundbreaking paper to show that, yes, the body can create proteins when mRNA is injected. You can read about the details in my book, and it was groundbreaking stuff, but it was largely forgotten, and people don't realize this. Carrico and Weissman tried to start a biotech company. They couldn't raise any money. People were like, yeah, interesting paper, but it was kind of forgotten. And it's not really, people didn't think it was going to be applicable and you could actually use it for anything. So it took a couple other researchers, including a real character named Luigi Warren at MIT, who gets no credit, who kind of rediscovered this paper and said, you know what, that paper from a few years ago, maybe we can use it. Excuse me. So again, it's that baton that was passed from one researcher or one group of researchers to another. And that's what it took to make mRNA work. And eventually we got to the point at the end, and NIH and researchers there were very important too. The government helped. So it was private industry, it was public as well. But it got to the point where at the end of 2019, there were a number of researchers around the world who thought they had an approach that could work if a new virus emerged. They weren't sure. They suspected. They were pretty confident, but they didn't know for sure. There was no certainty involved. But Moderna, BioNTech, some people at the NIH, a few others, they thought this mRNA thing could work, but it was no sure thing. One more reason to, and I'm going to emphasize this, we need to appreciate the enormity of this achievement. And I don't think we really do. And again, we weren't sure that this thing would work at the end of 2019, early 2020, but it's thanks to these researchers who said, we're gonna prove you, we're gonna prove the world, and we're gonna throw ourselves into this thing. So those are two of the vaccines. That's the Pfizer BioNTech vaccine, and that's the Moderna vaccine. Those are mRNA vaccines. The other vaccine approach I write about I start with AIDS and the search for an HIV vaccine. And I do so for a few reasons. And that's kind of how I start my book. Partly because I kept doing this research and I'm writing about the vaccine approaches, and I kept hearing about AIDS vaccine. Oh yeah, then the AIDS vaccine, Greg. And I was like, guys, correct me if I'm wrong, but we don't have an AIDS vaccine, right? Why do you keep talking to me about these AIDS vaccines? And they're like, no, Greg, we don't have a vaccine for AIDS, but we learned so much along the way. And I didn't realize that as an outsider, somebody not from the world of science, I kind of thought, okay, they failed. They tried. I knew a little bit of the history, and they tried to develop vaccines for AIDS, to protect against AIDS, but we're still waiting on one. And that's not the way to look at it yet. There's no failure in science. They learned so much along the way. So you'll read in the book about how Merck and others developed an approach using a virus to, as part of a vaccine, to send a message to the body. And that's all to create a protein. And let me take a step back, because not everyone is fully familiar with what vaccines are. All vaccines are is an education for the body's immune system. We're teaching the body. And in this case, we're teaching the body to recognize a protein. So when I talk about how mRNA sends a message, it's messenger RNA, we're sending the body a message to create a protein. And we can all guess what that protein is, right? The spike protein. So that's the hallmark characteristic of this coronavirus. It's also, frankly, with HIV also, there's a spike protein that many have worked on in terms of vaccines. So the whole idea is to tell the body to create a protein, the spike protein, and then the immune system recognizes that, hey, that spike protein is foreign, it looks dangerous, and it's educated to fight it. That's why when we take the vaccines, sometimes we have a reaction, because the body's immune system is set off. It's instructed to kind of target. And that's the same exact thing. And why do we do that? Because then if we ever experience the virus the genuine virus for real, then we know the body's immune system has been taught to protect and to target and to fight off and fend off this new virus. So all we're doing with the mRNA vaccines is sending a message to the body, a very short-lived message. Remember, mRNA is very short-lived, to create a spike protein. The body's immune system is educated, and we're off to the races and we're protected. And that's similar to what we did with AIDS, and we just did it in different ways with a virus bringing a genetic message. And the J&J, the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, and the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccines, they both use a different approach. It's called an adenovirus approach, and as opposed to the mRNA approach. And believe it or not, those approaches were developed for AIDS. And again, going back to that theme that, as the scientists were telling me, Greg, we learned so much in our efforts to combat AIDS. We learned how to conduct big trials. We learned about the body's immune system, but we also developed this approach using this thing called adenovirus, using a virus to send a genetic message to create, in this case, the spike protein. And that eventually got us to the Johnson & Johnson and the AstraZeneca Oxford vaccines. So it all started back in HIV, and also an unlikely process in a lot of ways, which is why I focus on it and write about it in my book. So before I get to just a few last observations and lessons from the experience from this era, I want to underscore the theme of appreciation and how it is in many ways an unlikely miracle that we have these vaccines as quick as we do. Now, one thing we have to obviously appreciate is that there was years of work that went into these vaccines and these approaches, and they weren't done quickly, as some people suspect, and some people accuse the vaccine companies of, and that's what my book is about, the years of work that went into it. But it's also the case that it was done very quickly in 2020 as well. And when I talk about appreciation, let me put it to you this way. In May of 2020, Moderna was running out of money and couldn't find it anywhere. They had a vaccine that they were convinced was going to work, was effective, and could protect, and they didn't have money to manufacture it. And they went to the Gates Foundation. They went to Merck. They went to the US government. They couldn't get the financing. And the people within Moderna were so frustrated because they thought they could save lives and they thought they could change history. And they had stepped up. They went all out. And yet they didn't have money. And it was running out, and they were in some trouble. And there's a gentleman named Juan Andres I write about, and he's the head of manufacturing at Moderna. Really interesting character. He's not a scientist himself, but he's been in the world of science. And early on, we're talking January or so of 2020, he became very worried about this virus. And he told his family, he lives outside of Boston. He said to his family, we've got to prepare. He bought rolls of toilet paper. He bought paper towels. He bought a third refrigerator and stocked it up. And his wife and his kids, his daughters thought he was crazy. They were rolling their eyes. They were, come on, really? A third refrigerator, Juan, really? But I think it was a month or 2 months later, his mother-in-law died of COVID. And just like the rest of us, his family realized how dangerous this virus was. And Juan Andres wanted to be the one to step up and build these vaccines. But again, by May of 2020, Moderna was running out of money. And in the end, they turned to Wall Street. And they sold $1.3 billion of shares that month. And Stefan Bancel, the CEO of Moderna, took that check, gave it to Juan Andres and said, go, 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 spend, 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 build these vaccines. And we are quick to dismiss big pharma, little pharma, medium pharma. We're quick to criticize Wall Street. And there's reason to be critical of both those industries. I'm at Wall Street Journal. We often are critical, and I've written critical stories myself, but we also have to be appreciative when they do step up. And if it were not for these investors buying up all the shares of Moderna, then we wouldn't have the vaccine as quick as we did. It would have been months later. So that's one reason for appreciation, but it's also the case with the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine. Ugur Sahin, remember that CEO I told you about of BioNTech, who got convinced that this virus was going to be dangerous and that his company could build a vaccine. They did build a vaccine, but they needed help, and they reached out to Pfizer. And there was a senior scientist named Phil Dormitzer that Ugur reached out to and said, hey, let's work together. That's what Ugur said to him. Let's build a vaccine. And Phil Dormitzer said, no, I don't want us taking our eye off the ball. We're building a flu vaccine together. I'm not sure this virus is really going to last. I'm not sure how dangerous it is. Luckily, Ugur Sahin turned to a different senior scientist, Catherine Jansen at Pfizer, and convinced her that they should work together. But once again, it could have gone a very different direction. So one more reason to be appreciative of how quick these vaccines were developed and how effective they are. And had this virus emerged 2017, 2016, we might still be waiting for a vaccine. So that's an overview of my book, A Shot to Save the World. I'm just going to end with just a couple thoughts about this era and about these achievements. One is that it's striking how the CEOs of these companies have told me, and they've told others, that were it not for American investors, American backing, American scientists, creativity of these researchers, these vaccines probably wouldn't be possible. I'm a capitalist. I'm a big believer that capitalism is the worst system, if other than every other one. So the reason to fault capitalism, but it is the reason why we have these vaccines, because only in America do we have investors who are willing to write checks, billions of dollars of checks. We're talking about venture capital investors. We're talking about mom and pops like you and I, on the hopes that down the road, someday there'll be a payoff. And that's for years. Moderna was raising billions of dollars. BioNTech was. They went public, both those companies, no earnings anywhere in sight. And it's something very unique to this country. It's also true that a lot of the innovation behind these vaccines came from American laboratories. The creativity is something we have to appreciate. But there's a flip side. The other side of that coin is, I don't think it's shocking as much as, although it is distressing, how many people in this country, just like the researchers who ignored the experts when it came to mRNA and said, yeah, the conventional wisdom says, don't waste your time, but I'm going to focus on it anyway and find a solution. We have a lot of those characters in our country saying, I'm going to ignore my doctor, or I'm going to ignore experts, and I'm going to instead rely on a YouTube video that my brother-in-law sent me. And he said something about the vaccines and being dangerous and harmful. And I've got some drug that no one's tested, and I'm going to take that instead. So the other side of that individualism, I think that we should be very proud of in this country, and has resulted in all kinds of achievement and accomplishment, all kinds of different fields, including in the world of biotech. The flip side is the self-confidence and maybe self-delusion to ignore the experts and rely on one's own research when it comes to Facebook and YouTube videos and such. And that's very distressing and discouraging for somebody like myself, who talks to these researchers who are behind the vaccines. And can you imagine you're working at one of these companies and you've gone all out for the last 2 years to try to help people? And yes, sure, do they want to get rich and famous? Definitely. But they also want to help and save lives. So for them to go all out, and not only do 30% or so of our neighbors not want to roll up their sleeves and get vaccinated, but they're pointing the fingers at these researchers and they're accusing them of certain things, of hurting people. And it's heartbreaking for some of the people that I've talked to. They're exhausted, they're drained, they're emotionally damaged, and from the effort. And yet they're subject to accusations. The Moderna people had to take down the sign in front of their manufacturing lab facility in Norwood, Massachusetts, partly because there were so many kind of crazy people coming to the campus and accusing them of certain things. Other people just came because they wanted the first batch of the vaccines. So that was another reason they took the name off. So I want to end on a little more positive note. Again, I've been very reassured and impressed by these scientists and these researchers, and there's so many of them who have now shifted, and I want to kind of end on a more positive note. They've shifted back to their original passions. Dan Baruch up in Boston, and the guy behind the J&J vaccine, he wants to develop an AIDS vaccine. Asymptomatic and her husband, Ugur Sahin at BioNTech, they're focused on cancer and other things as well. Moderna is trying to get a vaccine for RSV and CMV and other kind of viruses. So I'm encouraged and I'm hopeful about the future, and the fact that these innovative, creative, resilient scientists are focusing on the next challenge, the next pathogen, the next disease, to me is uplifting, and I'd like to end on that more hopeful note. So I'm going to stop now and take any questions at all. If people have questions about the book or anything else related to the pandemic or anything else.
We have a question right over here.
Thanks again. That was a wonderful presentation. You didn't speak a lot about the government and the FDA approval process. And I remember reading some articles talking about how the fastest FDA approval process, I believe, was measles or mumps. And it was like 4 years. And how this, of course, was in less than a year that it came out. What's the implication for the FDA approval process as a result of that? It seems like, superficially, it was very inefficient and cumbersome and perhaps bureaucratic, overly so, when you look at how these vaccines were created in such a short period of time. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Sure. And I'll roll that question into one that I think earlier someone asked me, and I'd be glad to answer if there's an interest. Some people want to know about Operation Warp Speed and whether it was helpful or not. Raise your hand if that's something you want me to talk about as well. Yeah, people often want to know about that. So in terms of the process, I do want to make it clear that nothing was rushed. And often people have that concern in terms of testing, in terms of the trials. That's reassuring, but you are right that things were done quicker than in the past. And the people I've talked to believe that perhaps we're in a new era where again, we don't want to suggest that things can be done cutting corners and accelerated, but the bureaucracy that you suggest is an issue. And I have mixed feelings about that, because I've also talked to some people recently who are worried that not enough has changed. and the reaction they're getting about now they're trying to build a pan coronavirus vaccine, a lot of people, which would be wonderful for us. So you go into, and I think we're going to get there, but it'll take a few years, where you go into your doctor's office and you get a vaccine for all the coronaviruses, the earlier ones, this one, and it protects you from future ones, but also maybe they're rolling in to one with flu. So you have a flu vaccine rolled into one. Novovax and some other people working on that. Drew Weissman, one of the people I mentioned earlier, one of the architects, that mRNA early research, critical research, groundbreaking research is working on a pan coronavirus one. So there has been some improvement in terms of that process that is encouraging. And then I'm going to just talk a second about Operation Warp Speed. So it's my belief, and maybe you can sense this. I'm a kind of a moderate. We at the Wall Street Journal on the news side are sort of straight down the middle, and that's in keeping is the reason I stay there so long. I believe in that approach. I believe that Operation Warp Speed, those on the left don't give it enough credit, and those on the right give it too much credit. So those who are not familiar, Operation Warp Speed was the effort by the Trump administration to do two things: to finance, to write big checks to various vaccine companies, and to help them in terms of resources. And I'll talk about that in a second. And it was a really successful effort in that they picked 6 vaccine approaches. I'm sorry, 3 vaccine approaches, 2 vaccine companies within each. So 6 vaccines total, and 5 out of the 6 have been proven successful so far. Even the 6th, I think we're going to eventually see. And those were Moderna and the Pfizer one when it comes to mRNA, the Johnson Johnson and AstraZeneca Oxford one, the adenovirus, and there's a protein subunit one, that's Novovax and GSK and Sanofi. So you got to give them a lot of credit. The money accelerated the process. So again, those on the left don't give it enough credit. And not only that, it wasn't just the money. So there's a former general now named General Perna, Gus Perna, who was the head of logistics for the Army, just making sure everyone was fed. It's kind of thing where you only notice these kinds of people, these kind of issues when something goes wrong, but it's very important work. And he shifted to work on Operation Warp Speed, and he provided crucial, important work, help to companies, things like getting bridges closed so that Moderna could ship something and or little parts that they needed from different parts of the country. If you remember the summer of 2020, it was difficult shipping and transportation and such. And that kind of stuff from Operation Warp Speed was really important. So on the one hand, it should get more credit than people on the left give it. On the other hand, those on the right that give it all the credit. Well, Pfizer didn't take money for developing its vaccine. They were already developing it on its own. They didn't want to take money from the government. They did take money from the government later, and money's fungible, so you don't want to go overboard there. But if you're the first company that Operation Warp Speed wrote a big check to was AstraZeneca, and that didn't even help us in the United States. It helped elsewhere. And Moderna, remember when I said Moderna went to the government in May 2020 and couldn't get any money. So I don't want to give too much credit, but Operation Warp Speed was helpful.
I think we have one over here, Greg.
That's obviously that the mRNA approach was very successful. However, there were other, and the American efforts in this respect were overwhelming. But we know also about some efforts made in Russia, the so-called Sputnik, and the Chinese vaccine. So my question is, can you tell us anything about this? And since you are a Wall Street person, can you explain why the Moderna stock increased by an order of magnitude based on the success of the vaccine, whereas Pfizer, which used the same approach, the stock increased only 50%. So is there any justification for this dichotomy?
Sure. So I'll address the question of the Russian Sputnik vaccine, but also let me make it a little broader. The Chinese have their own vaccine approaches, and I could talk about them. Listen, both Sputnik and the Chinese vaccines, were they the only ones available in the world? We'd all be rolling up our sleeves, or maybe not all of us, but I would be okay rolling up my sleeves and being vaccinated. That said, they're not nearly as effective. So the Sputnik one, I don't get too detailed into it, but it's a combination of it's the J&J and Oxford approach using an adenovirus. It's using a virus to transport the genetic message to the body to create this spike protein. It uses something called Ad5. Ad5 was used by Merck to fight to develop their AIDS vaccine, and it didn't work. It's not to say that it's not AIDS and HIV and coronavirus are very different. So, but it's not a great approach, but they mix it with Ad5 with another one for the second shot. So it's not a terrible one, but it's not the most transparent. Their data isn't as good. For a long time, Putin wouldn't get vaccinated. So that may tell you something. So it seems like it's a good one, but not a great one. Similarly, the Chinese vaccines are okay. They're not bad. They're just not as good. And there's a reason why. I end off my book with Ugur Sahin being wooed and talking to Chinese officials because they'd like that vaccine there. And Hong Kong today has both the Pfizer vaccine as well as Sinovac, the Chinese one. So they're good vaccines, they're just not as good. And in terms of stock price, Moderna is a vaccine company and all its earnings come from their COVID-19 vaccine, whereas we all know Pfizer is a big company. So their earnings get watered down. But not just that, they've got to split their earnings with BioNTech. BioNTech is the German company, Ugur Sahin's company. So BioNTech itself has soared and done nicely. But it's just not a pure play, as they call on Wall Street. Pfizer isn't. But yeah, Pfizer has gone up, just not as much.
And just a wonderful talk.
Oh, thank you.
Why does the body's immune system kind of lose its memory over time, I guess, and the protection fades?
Excuse me. Yes, it does have to be reminded at times, the education. That's a good question. I'm not sure. It's not unprecedented. There are other vaccines where you have to get a booster, not every kind of 6 months or so. What I find kind of fascinating is that for all the criticisms of these vaccines, and I'm not some rah-rah vaccine person necessarily, I'm impressed by them and thankful for them, but they're not perfect. But the crazy thing for me is that we haven't adjusted them yet for Omicron, for BA2, for any of the variants, and yet they're pretty darn effective. So they could be more effective if we need be. We could adjust them to target these variants. We're still using the existing original vaccines. So sometimes the body has to be reminded, and partly it's because of these variants. So if we didn't have a variant, I'm not sure, or variants as challenging. I mean, Omicron, frankly, I talked to some of these researchers when Omicron first emerged, and they were nervous. They were worried that they might have to rejigger this vaccine, make it target specifically Omicron. So they're a little bit concerned. And frankly, part of it is we're just a little bit, I won't say conservative, we're trying to be careful. So there are a number of scientists who say maybe we don't need necessarily be rushing to get boosted. There are a lot of people that say we don't need the fourth booster, unless you're immunocompromised and such. You've got some long-lived protection as well, T-cell protection. So there's reason for more reassurance. And maybe there are some people that didn't even think we needed the booster. So there's a debate that goes on, but thankfully these vaccines have relatively little risk. I don't want to say there's no risk. I don't want to exaggerate things. There is a risk with these vaccines. When I drive home tonight, I'm taking risk. We're all going to unfortunately take risk when we get in our cars, but it's minimal risk, thankfully. So yeah, helps answer that. I think we have a question in front there.
Yeah, I got it.
You're saying there are some risks. What are the risks?
I mean, listen, there's some people that have had some rare reactions. They are rare. They are exaggerated by those vaccine hesitant people. So I don't want to, I'm not here to stir concern or worry, but yeah, they're minimal, they're rare, but with every, listen, you take any kind of drug or you go under surgery, and it's a weird thing to me. I mean, you step on a nail, you get a tetanus shot. Does anybody ask the history and the skepticism? Do they go on YouTube to find out their brother-in-law said about on Facebook about the tetanus shot? No, but something about these vaccines has caused, I think it's where we are as a people, as a nation. Everything is politicized. It's sad for me. It's scary for me. I don't see much of a change in the short term, unfortunately. So people have exaggerated the risks, but yeah, there have been rare, very rare reactions, much like other rare reactions to drugs and vaccines.
Hello, thank you so much for your talk.
Sure.
Your book is very fascinating. Something about your concluding thoughts kind of caught me off guard a little bit. The part where you said people are ignoring the research and researchers and should be appreciating, their efforts to try and bring vaccine information to the public. And I totally agree with that. But I'm a health science librarian, and I've been assisting people to find information on the vaccine for the last 2 years. A lot of the people that approach me that are vaccine hesitant are very well educated, and they provide their own research to counteract what I tell them. And a lot of them, a lot of the anti-vaccine movement comes from people within the research world. I mean, Dr. Andrew Wakefield, he was the guy that started the autism is caused by vaccine movement. The pandemic movie that came out last year that said that the whole vaccine is a conspiracy, created to create microchips in our brains. Like they featured a doctor, Dr. Judy Mukovitz there. So there is a reason why there's hesitancy, because there are people with doctors who are claiming to be experts who are promoting it as well. So I was just wondering, in any of the interviews that you conducted, did you encounter any doctors or scientists or researchers that had that kind of perspective on the vaccines? And also, as a reporter as well, do you think that there is an ethical obligation for them to put aside their bias for the interest of public health and good?
It's a great question. First of all, thank you for your own work, your day-to-day efforts to educate people. And thank you for those healthcare members of the healthcare world who are here tonight for your work. So let me answer that in a few different ways. The first is, had I not done all this research, I might be hesitant about the vaccines as well. And often when I speak to audiences, there's a segment, a group in the audience that is reasonably concerned or concerned for reasonable reasons. They'll say something like, well, Greg, didn't I read in your book that the average vaccine takes 10 years to develop? And the fastest one ever until COVID was 4 years. And you're telling me, Greg, that in 330 days, and that's what it took, 330 days from the time the sequence was revealed until authorization of the first vaccine. That's all it took. Why shouldn't I be nervous? And I probably would be concerned as well. And this isn't a direct answer. I'll get to your question in a second, but maybe it is helpful for people as well. The way I answer those kinds of people, maybe you all have in your lives those types of people who are reasonably concerned, not the people that think we have chips in our brain, that kind of thing, and Bill Gates and George Soros and I don't know who else has conspired to hurt us all, but reasonable people. The reason why we were able to do it so quickly in 330 days is of course, all that work that I talk about over the years. There was years and years of work that led into these vaccines, but also for the first time ever, we developed, tested, did trials, and manufactured vaccines simultaneously, and for good reason. So think about it. Why would you manufacture a vaccine? It costs billions and billions of dollars. Why would you manufacture a vaccine before it was approved? We've never done that in history. And yet we did it last year. And why did we do it last year? Because we had a lot of money sloshing around and available for these companies like Moderna. So if they have the money, yeah, they'll build these vaccines, or they'll manufacture them before they've been approved. But until this last year, we never had that. So they took the chance. They did those different phases, those stages simultaneously. And that is the real explanation for why we did it in 330 days. To address your question, so it is striking how many scientists, researchers, doctors are behind some of the skepticism. So I would answer that two ways. You've got some who aren't really experts in this field, and you have to be very careful. You read op-eds all the time, and frankly, you know, close to home, we published them. Super smart, established, credentialed, acclaimed even scientists, doctors, researchers who are just not infectious disease experts. They're not virologists. They're not. They don't know much about the vaccine process. They've got a certain perspective, but they're not. Their expertise is not this area. And doctors are very confident people, and they like to share opinions. So those people, I find that very dangerous when you're not necessarily an expert. I mean, I'm no expert. I just talk to the people who work on these areas, who are established, and they're not foolproof, but these are the leading voices. So you've got some of those people that you have to be careful of, who are behind some of these efforts, and frankly, some of these people are also behind. We could talk about the origins issue. The origins issue is another controversial one. If you want me to talk about that, but then you do have some people who are hesitant, and you say or raised questions, and I have to talk to some part of my research. I mean, Luigi Warren's a fascinating guy. He played an important role in developing mRNA, and before I think he was kicked off Twitter, he's raised a lot of questions about these vaccines. And, you know, these are type A, brilliant, quirky. My book is about really unusual characters, and it takes sort of these unusual personalities to develop these vaccines and to change the world. And yes, it's there are some who have raised questions, and that's okay. You can have a minority who raise questions, but the majority have been reassuring. And the proof is in the pudding. I mean, my gosh, these vaccines, it's over a year at this point. There were a lot of people early on who I trusted who kind of said, Greg, for the first year or so, you're never 100% sure about vaccines. You want to wait, but it's been a while, and there are a lot of billions of people have had it, and I don't believe the government. I'm not some conspiracy theorist where the government's hiding their information. And you know, there's a famous guy, Robert Malone, who's been very controversial, and he was on Joe Rogan. He's the reason why that interview was the reason why Joe Rogan got so much criticism and such. And there's a really great podcast called Science Versus or Science V, I forget, where they went through all of Malone's criticisms and they refuted each of them, and they showed how he was exaggerating. Now, why he exaggerates, I'm not sure, but he's a credible doctor, and we have to give him a lot of thanks for some early work on mRNA. He worked with that individual I mentioned earlier, John Wolfe. But sometimes people share their opinions, and we don't have to necessarily subscribe to them.
I think we have time for one last question, and then we'll do signing in the theater, in the lobby.
You're so passionate about each and every book. Are you working on a new book now? I mean, are you just, this is obviously new.
Right. So as you kind of suggest, if I'm going to spend a couple years on a book, throw myself into it, it's a difficult process, as I'm sure many people know. Many people have written books in this room. On average, I went to bed at 3 a.m. I was taking a shower at 2:30 a.m. I can remember, and getting up relatively early and starting all over again. I did 3 all-nighters. I remember I didn't even do those in college, where I just kind of worked the whole way through. Part of it because it was real time, and part of it because it's difficult stuff. Trying to understand it all, then have to explain it to the masses. So the point being, I've got to really be passionate about the topic. So I'm just thankful that I've had opportunity over the last few years, find some things that I'm excited about. But it's not easy to find good topics where there are interesting personalities or characters or important topics, at least to me, and those that I don't know much about. I throw myself to stuff partly selfishly to learn and understand. So I don't have anything right now that I'm as passionate about, and it's kind of a high bar. So if you have good ideas, let me hear them.
Thank you.
Thank you for everyone's attention.